Hello and welcome to The Best Ever, a unique wrestling analysis podcast from ProWrestlingMusings.com, looking at some of the best wrestling matches ever through the eyes of some of the best fans ever. I am Craig from Pro Wrestling Musings, and today I am delighted to be joined by Sergei Alderman, also from Pro Wrestling Musings. Sergei, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Craig. Thank you.
So, for the listeners, who exactly are you and how have you ended up on this podcast?
Well, my name is Sergei Alderman, and I've been a fan of pro wrestling for, about 20 years. I've been like a really serious fan of it, got back into it. I had a period of being into it when I was a small child. That was ended by a friend of the family telling me that it wasn't real, which, broke my little child heart. At the time, this was in the early 80s. I years later, I didn't even know what it was I had been watching. It is, afterwards, I was like, this was too early the main thing I remember was hating Roddy Piper. It's like, when I looked into it a little bit further, it's like, no, this was before he was in WWE or WWF. And I realized that it was a period when he was the color commentator for, I believe, Georgia Wrestling, one of the NWA shows, the Crockett Show, I believe. He was. So he was on the show the whole time, and I feel cheated because I missed the big babyface turn when, just the other night, they did the whole angle of a bad guy, going after the non-fighting member of a announce team, and then the color commentator, he used to be a wrestler coming out of retirement to defend them. And, they did that angle to turn Piper heel, and turn him face, and I missed that whole drama, because I had, but then many years later, my wife came across SmackDown and the Undertaker putting Stephanie on a symbol and sort of crucifying her, and was like, what on earth is this? And she started watching it and got me into it, and I've been watching it since. Data analysis is kind of what I do, and I always like to find ways to apply it to my hobbies. And I have been looking for different ways to do that with pro wrestling, many different ways, like analyzing the family tree of lineages of trainer to mentor to protege. That's really interesting. And then also trying to do ELO rankings based on the types of strength of competition rankings that people do in other kinds of competitions like chess. But I really found your analysis of offense really fascinating, and I was like, okay, I'm going to take this data and what can I do with it? And I developed the Styles Make Fights dashboard, which I use to analyze upcoming matches and then go back and analyze what I got right or wrong about them after the fact in my Styles Make Fights series of columns. So that's what I do. That's my interest in pro wrestling and my fandom and my application of analysis to that, and what I do with the Pro Wrestling Musings website.
Brilliant. You've covered like 3 of my questions in that comprehensive answer. So you said kind of where and when you got into wrestling and then what brought you back. Why do you think that wrestling in particular holds your attention?
For me, it's all about great stories that engage the audience's emotions. And there's a lot of aspects to that. There's something really special about a story that we all kind of have to agree on. There's something specific that happens with pro wrestling opposed to a lot of kinds of storytelling. With most kinds of storytelling, if what you do doesn't hit with most of your audience, well, they don't necessarily know that. You know, if it works for you, but it didn't work for the rest of the audience, if you're watching a regular TV show, well, you don't know that until you go to Reddit to argue, like, oh, shoot, nobody else liked this episode. You know, wrestling's different. You've got a live audience. It's letting you know, right, live as we go, did this work? And you know, when it does, it can be really magical because you're a part of, you become a part of a community that are all responding emotionally to a story someone's telling. And I think that's the thing that I like the most about pro wrestling, and that is why I chose the match that I chose, in the sense of that it is a really effective story that really engages the emotions of the audience.
So it's like the dynamic between the performance art and the crowd's sort of instantaneous reaction.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I don't know. So my last question before we start chatting about the actual statistics were why did you choose this match? Because for me it was quite left field. It wasn't one that it's not one that tends to be in the conversation of kind of Hulk Hogan versus The Rock or, you know, Taker, HBK. Even in terms of NXT, it tends to be Bayley versus Sasha that's spoken about, whereas you chose this match, which you've just briefly mentioned that you think really struck that kind of connection with the crowd. Would you like to expand on that just a little bit?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And I don't mean that that it connected with the audience more so than Bayley versus Sasha. That was also a very emotional match in a very different way. But what's really amazing for me about the match is that it connected with the audience's emotions with a story that isn't simple. It's a very it's a bitter pill to swallow kind of a story. This is a story of someone who is trying, someone with heart. They're telling the heart story, which is a huge story in pro wrestling. This person has so much heart, and they're going to give it their all to defeat someone who's almost undefeatable. And, you know, a lot of times they succeed, but how well can you tell the story and engage with people when you're telling the story of when that doesn't lead to success? When, you know, yes, she has all the heart in the world, but she can't get the job done. She didn't get the job done. What does that mean for people, and how do people respond to it? It was, for me, one of the best examples of that kind of story. I mean, there are others, you know, Flair versus HBK, the retirement match. You know, there's plenty of matches you can think of where the big spot, and that's one thing I'm going to go into, is that to get the full story of the match, you can't stop when the bell rings, because a big part of the story of the match is after Asuka's music stops playing and Bayley's alone in the ring, and the fans' connection with her and what she's going through emotionally in that moment. And we've seen that moment play out in other examples, like Flair. Usually and this is actually a story that's told a lot in that situation that Bayley was in, going out on your backstory. Whether you're retiring or moving on to a different promotion. So you've got people who moved on from Indies to the WWF, or you've got, in this case, people moving on from NXT to the main roster. I just think it did a great job of telling that story. It was really engaging emotionally. I was trying to think of a match that I love especially that is going to be the same as everybody else's. And I was thinking of different ones that I might suggest. I was thinking of that great series of matches between Paul London and Akio that were on Velocity, some oddball matches that are just real special favorites of mine that aren't necessarily spoken of as much. And then I was like, well, wait a second. Am I giving the women's side enough credit? Is there a women's match that's like that specifically jumps out at me? And then I immediately thought of Asuka versus Bayley. Another thing about it is that a lot of times with that kind of story, like say Flair versus HBK.
Sure.
HBK is not the bad guy there.
No.
But at the same time, Flair isn't. The story is that Flair isn't who he used to be, and he's got it to put out to pasture. This isn't Bayley. Bayley's not in that situation. She's is intimidated by just how good Asuka is, but at the same time, she's still great. She's on her way up. She is not. This isn't a retirement match, so it's not that kind of story. But you have Bayley, but you have Asuka, who is the kind of character that could easily be a super hated villain, but she isn't. This is the kind of character that I call the monster babyface, in the sense of it's like the monster heel, but the fans love them anyway. Yeah. Usually, I don't know if that was the case with Asuka. I think that she was always presented as someone they expected the fans to love, but a lot of the times with a monster babyface, it's an accident. They never intended this person to be face. The fans just latched onto them. Just, we've decided we do not care how brutal and vicious this person is. It's just fun watching them kick ass, and they just will not, no matter what, they're just like, nope, we like them, and they won't give you the reaction that you want. And it's a character that's difficult to tell stories with. I know that I was looking at your lineup of favorite matches that you're going to talk with people about. And I know one of them is Rock versus Brock, and that's a great example of Brock was supposed to be the bad guy, and the fans just said, nah. And, but
I think Malachi Black might be going in that direction as well as a topical one.
Malachi Black is definitely a character that is set up as sinister and evil, but whether anybody will boo them is very questionable.
Yeah. In terms of monster babyface, that's a really interesting term. I think it's kind of words for how I often felt about Okada in Japan, because he was often not the bad guy, but he was often positioned almost like the mountain to be climbed come Wrestle Kingdom for Naito or whomever, Ibushi, whoever it was. So that's a really interesting phrase, and it's one that I really quite like. Because I'm, as you know, I often don't like heel shenanigans in a match, so I quite like that kind of monster babyface. It's just they're really good and they can win, and the story is that people have to try and climb that. So I really like that.
The other thing about the monster babyface is it allows them to work as a tweener in the sense of who they can face. That they can be tons of fun to watch them give comeuppance to a heel you hate, and at the same time they can just be equally fun to watch a babyface you're rooting for try to find a way to beat them, and even if they just struggle to find that way.
Kind of like Cody during his TNT run, he would kind of switch kind of roles depending on who he was against. Okay.
That's true, but at the same time, Cody also had more of a mix of he was always he used more fouls than what I would consider. He was more of a tweener and less of a monster babyface, if you see what I'm saying. He mixed in a little bit more fouls and cheating and dirty tactics.
Perfect, yeah. So, this match, I've been doing a bit of a lead up just to set the scene. So, Asuka versus Bayley, this was the second time they'd clashed in NXT. The first time was when Bayley's title reign was ended by Asuka. A big part of the Asuka story in NXT was she was undefeated, and they did a heck of a job as presenting her as undefeated. It wasn't one of those kind of, quite often when a guy or a girl comes into the company, they're undefeated for, 6 or 7 matches. Asuka's undefeated streak, I think in the end, it outdid Goldberg's in terms of, the amount of matches it encompassed. Now, obviously, WWE were probably trying to achieve that, and there would have been house shows and stuff, but she did feel like a big deal as an undefeated character in a way that it's hard to replicate. So the other part of Bayley's story was she'd been injured since losing to Asuka and had been out for a bit. She'd also remained in NXT while Banks, Flair, and Becky Lynch went off to the main roster. So there was the kind of the four of them, and she was left behind. But she was kind of the champion and was elevated by their absence also. Bayley, of course, was the ultimate underdog in NXT, and therefore this dynamic was really cool as she was going in against the undefeated champion. So they were very, very oppositional in terms of their presentation. Bayley won the belt originally at Brooklyn 1 against Sasha Banks in that really, really famous match. And this was a year later, the second Brooklyn show that would become a staple of the kind of golden era of NXT. And the other thing, this title was a really big deal at this time. It was this was the beginnings of it becoming quite a prestigious title. It had gone from Paige to Charlotte to Sasha Banks to Bayley and then to Asuka. So that title lineage is quite a noteworthy one. It wasn't like the men's championship, which did have a few quite developmental guys like Bo Dallas that, didn't quite make the grade as much as they perhaps could have done. Sergei, is there anything from the build up to this match that you think is worth adding, or is that kind of it with a neat bow?
Yeah, no, that tells the story real well. Let me think. Sorry. Yeah, I think that the thing to remember is that as fans, we had a pretty good idea that this was a leaving town match.
Yeah,
That was the most likely outcome. But there was still the glimmer of hope that, okay, maybe she wants one more run with it. And she just really came across as someone who, Bayley was always just so genuine and had such a connection with the fans. And then Asuka had this different kind of connection with the fans of just people just loved watching her strikes and seeing the kind of chaos that she created. So it was a pretty amazing build up. I mean, it was a co-main event, and it was topped by Shinsuke versus Samoa Joe. And you really can't have a double main event. Well, it was really more of a triple main event. You had three matches in a row of the three championship matches of the three main divisions, tag, women's and men's. And, those three matches being FTR versus the DIY, which is about as classic as you get of that era of NXT, and then Asuka versus Bayley, and then Shinsuke versus Joe. It was just an incredible second half of a pay-per-view. It was like, I would still consider Brooklyn 2 one of the best pay-per-views ever put together, just in terms of just, everything clicked.
Yeah, and this kind of era of NXT is these are the kind of wrestlers that you're naming there. Those are the ones that I kind of think back fondly, having watched them in kind of recent memory. So I'm going to do a quick sort of whistle stop tour of what stuck out in the match just from my rewatch, and then we'll move on to the statistics. So the beginning of this match had like a whole minute of feeling out. There was no offensive blows kind of struck. It was a lot of standing back, taking in the motion, and then kind of reversals, bits and pieces of reversals. The crowd are hugely into it. They're cheering, going crazy, which is kind of nice and sad looking back on when you kind of look at what's going on with this company and in fact this brand at the moment. There's 3 pinfall attempts from Bayley kind of within the first 2 minutes. It kind of telling the story of this being urgent. She really doesn't want to allow Asuka to build momentum. Asuka really doesn't go down easy in this match at all when Bayley's in control. There are a lot of strikes, but not much of Asuka actually dropping to the mat. Bayley is ferocious any time an opportunity arises. She rains down strikes on Asuka, kind of feeding the idea that she's really, really worried and that she is not the favourite in this match. There's a really cool spot around 10 minutes where Bayley's shouting, "Hit me in the face," to Asuka. Asuka takes up that suggestion. Bayley actually manages to survive the onslaught and does a backslide. There's a cool spot where Bayley even fights out of Asuka's finishing by standing up and kind of elbowing her way out without having to use the ropes. There's another kind of reversal of the Asuka lot where she looks like she's got it in but can't quite get the legs in, and she has to finish this match by essentially just kicking Bayley so hard she can't get up, so she doesn't even manage to tap her out. Then, as you were saying, there's the respect post-match, there's the handshake, it's very, very NXT, and then you get the thank you Bayley send-off and the nice stuff with the 4 horsewomen, the hugging, fans cheering as she hugs Sasha and Becky, fans less happy as she hugs Charlotte, who I'm assuming was a heel on the main roster at the time. So is there any other spot that jumps out as being particularly noteworthy in this match, or will we dive into the kind of the numbers?
Another spot that jumped out at me was when they were in the ropes. That great hook kick that she uses, where she kind of pulls back her own foot with her hand to give it extra spring and then lets it go. That's such a great kick. That's a great one. And yeah, I agree that there are spots where she's showing basically fighting spirit, Japanese style fighting spirit. The one that you mentioned where she says, you know, hit me in the face. Hit me in the face. She had been kicking her in the chest while kneeling, and then she sort of stands up and just hit me in the face. That was really good. One thing that I think that's worth mentioning is that I know that he became incredibly annoying over time, especially his inability to deal with criticism and as people started to not like his work as much, as just tends to push back. But at this point, the color commentator, what was his name?
Corey Graves?
Corey Graves, yes.
Yeah.
Corey Graves just does a fantastic job on this match.
He was good. He was good on NXT, to be fair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I never really had any. I always felt very positively about his work until he went to the main roster, and then slowly sort of. Well, not the point. Point being, he was doing a fantastic job on this, just at putting over just how huge of a mountain that Bayley has to climb in Asuka. And you know, he all of his words went towards that. I think the one time it was when that spot that you were talking about where she says, you know, hit me in the face, and she seems to be getting the better of a striking situation. And Corey is like, maybe that's the key. Maybe that's the key to fighting Asuka is getting over the fear of her strikes and taking it to her with strikes, and then she hits her with a back fist. It's like, well, no, never mind.
That's fairly decent commentating. Yeah, I like that. So if we start to look at the graphics now, so we've got our first one, which is the straight up match stats. Sergei, what's the first stat that jumps out there for you as being significant in how the story was told, or what just seems like a important number?
Well, I mean, the important thing to look at with a match like this is comparing the strikes, or at the same time the match offenses, the relative match offense, and compare that with the strike down rate. This is a great example of that, where someone is taking the majority of strikes, someone is getting just barely the majority of match offense, but when you look at the strike down rate, it's just a huge difference in the other direction. And that tells you that this is that kind of a match. Other examples that we've seen recently would be Miro against Darby, or Miro against Lee Johnson. Great examples of this type of match where you've got someone giving their all against a monster, a mountain who just doesn't really have much give, and that's what really stands out for me.
Yes, we've got 57 strikes from Bayley to 39 from Asuka. However, as Sergei's pointing out there, 7% of Bayley's strikes downed Asuka, so 4 out of 57 compared to 11 out of 39 for Asuka. 28% strike down rate. That's one of the things that I highlighted as well. Strikes underscore Bayley's panic. She's trying to get in as many blows as she possibly can, and the strike downs kind of show off Asuka's striking ability. The next thing that kind of really stood out for me, Sergei, is Asuka's offense. Her kind of the way that she has, well, she's got a very, very obvious plan here. She's using loads and loads of strikes and a huge chunk of submission, and then she uses absolutely zero grapples, so sort of slamming moves, and no dives. Did this come as a surprise for you? Obviously, that's what people think of Asuka, but was it a surprise that she used nothing else at all?
I don't think as I was watching it, I ever thought, what happened to her suplexes? It's not where my mind was at. I don't know if we compared it to her other matches, if that's unusual for her, but not I don't believe so.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, fair point. Absolutely. The other thing that I thought that was really interesting, especially in the story of this match, is that Bayley goes absolutely nowhere near using any submissions, and she has to reverse a lot more. So these statistics, again, are all putting over how worried Bayley is about her opponent's offense. The submission, she's not going to try and get into a battle about that, but she's also having to reverse a lot more. To kind of underscore that, we've got a few more taunts from Asuka showing off her confidence, and then Asuka, when we're using that kind of big offense total, which eliminates short strikes and very, very short submissions, again, we see Asuka has more than double what Bayley has, despite Bayley having slightly more of the match offense. So again, that's a really good way that the statistics show how the match is structured. Bayley is a bit frantic. She's really worried about Asuka's strengths, avoids submissions, tries to hit her as quickly as possible. And yeah, it kind of shakes out, in my mind, how the match played out. But what I especially thought about these numbers was this is quite an extreme presentation of that. Like, having those zeros there is quite they're not playing around. It's a very solid message. Would you be in agreement there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you can do this more subtly, and it still works. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But in this case, it's not needed. It's not like the story was laid out so clearly that it's showing its own bones. Yeah. You just get too caught up in it for that to even be an issue. When you look at the stats, you go, "Oh, wow, they really told this story very clearly." Very there's no shades of gray in their offense mix. But yeah, that I don't think that affects the storytelling really.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll move on now to the flow of offense, which shows us minute by minute which wrestler was in control of the match. And the first thing that jumps out here is, although the match had a lot of reversals, there were, very quick maths, 42 reversals in total. Here we don't really see huge zigzags as the kind of match swung from side to side. In fact, what happens is there's big peaks for each wrestler. So Asuka kind of takes control at the beginning with a small kind of advantage. Then Bayley takes a huge advantage. Asuka eventually swings it back with kind of similar force, a big momentum shift towards her. Bayley takes control again, and then Asuka kind of ekes it out at the end. Sergei, did you, as a kind of a flow of offense, did you see this within the match, or does this line graph tell a different story from your kind of more subjective watching experience?
No, it is definitely matches what you see. live as you're watching and you're trying to follow along with what you see on the graph, sometimes it takes a minute to like, oh, that's where we are in the okay, because it may not be immediately clear, and then it's like, oh, okay, that must be that peak right there, because they. It is really back and forth in a really entertaining way, in the sense that even though you go into it expecting Asuka to win, expecting this is a last hurrah for Bayley, her hope spots, her moments of control, her two big sections of the match where she takes over are very convincing and very engaging. Just make me very rooting for her and like, okay, let's go. Let's see what you could do. I think though that the tail end of the match, the way that it peters out, is a really good. That really tells you the story. This is where it's a down ending, and that's the kind of ending it had. One of the spots that I think is probably one of the most important spots in the match is when right at the end, Bayley does a no-sell type of spot where she stands up and is like, let's see, she used like a really vicious kick that should have been a knockdown kick, would normally have been a knockdown kick, and instead Bayley stands up and shows what's the word, defiance. Like that's not going to take me down. And I think that it does a great job of showing, like I was talking about with in the Miro Johnson match, I mentioned how amazing it was the way that he did a no-sell, but then showed that is bravado. That's not I'm invulnerable. That's I am trying to intimidate you by, oh, that didn't hurt me at all. And in Miro's case, he couldn't stand up. It's really dramatic. In this case, it's the story seems to be that, like, if excuse me, if Bayley had succeeded in rattling Asuka, in making her believe that, well, shoot, my kicks aren't working. I don't know what happened. That should have kept her down. And if she had said, okay, I got to try a different strategy, that may have been a turning point for Bayley. But instead, Asuka said, I don't believe you, and just went to the same well again. Just kicked her more times, and that was the end. And kind of like how they finished off the match, and I think it's you see it in the graph, and it's very effective. Go on.
Kind of like Bayley. It's like your observation before about Corey Graves' commentary. It's kind of like Bayley almost had come to the same conclusion. Don't be afraid. It's not that bad. Don't be afraid. Take the fear away, and you'll beat her. But she was mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. So big swings in offense. Each of them gets in a lot when they're in control. Ultimately, Asuka is able to overrun Bayley's defiance. I would say that tells. The next graph is similar. So this is a cumulative flow of offense. It takes it's all of these kind of points on the line graph, and it's just adding them again after each minute. So minute 1 total plus the minute 2 total for minute 2, and then for 3 it's the following, it's minutes 1, 2 and 3 altogether. So the idea of this is it kind of shows how much each wrestler is taking as the match progresses. So as you can see there, Asuka takes a little bit more offense. Sorry, that's wrong. Asuka gets in a little bit more offense at the beginning. Then Bayley has this huge burst. Asuka gets back, and then Bayley has another burst. And by the end of the match, Bayley's actually hit Asuka with more punishment, but Asuka still wins the match. Sergei, you said that you found this graph really interesting when you first saw it. What was it about this graph that really caught your imagination?
We may have been talking about. I may have been referring to the previous one. The cumulative flow of offense is often difficult for me to wrap my mind around of how it's relevant. But in this case, I think that really what it's saying is that what we were saying about the raw numbers, Bayley does control the offense in this match, just not the big offense. And she needs to do that in order to be convincing, because Asuka has such an aura of invincibility about her. It's real similar to the way that what was the last pay-per-view? All Out? Or Double or Nothing? Double or Nothing.
Revolution? No, Double or Nothing. Double or Nothing.
A lot like how at Double or Nothing, Darby had to put out so much offense in order to be believable, because Miro is so invulnerable receiving. It's real similar here. She put out more of the offense, except at the very beginning. Asuka, during her second peak, almost just catches up with Bayley, but then falls behind her again in terms of cumulative, and that makes sense. It's just to make Bayley credible, and she is credible, and that's needed to tell the story. But just barely. It's like you can just barely believe that maybe she can pull it out, but you never believe that she has it in the bag at all. It's not. It's not a case of that they sometimes will tell the story of, I thought he had it, and then he blew it. Mistake, that kind of thing.
Whereas this one's a case of she almost earned it, but perhaps it was just out with her ability despite her doing so well, kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. And then on this one, we've got the small pie chart there in the right bottom hand corner, which kind of highlights Sergei's point. Although Bayley was throwing those kind of simple strikes around every opportunity she got, ultimately it was Asuka's big offense, her use of strike downs and long submissions that put away Bayley in the end. So yeah, absolutely. So the next bit, this is where we come to kind of the more interesting bit of the analysis. So the next bit that we're looking at is the per hour rates between Bayley and Asuka, and this doesn't really show too much on its own. It's just that 14 minutes of the match times up to get to an hour, so that we can compare matches of different lengths with each other. So when you see these numbers, it doesn't make a huge amount of points or cents without seeing it compared against other matches. So what I've done is, when we go on a couple of slides, there is Bayley versus Asuka II at Brooklyn compared with some other women's matches of recent times. So we've got Riho versus Serena Deeb from Double or Nothing. We've got Julia versus Tam from the All-Star Dream Cinderella in Stardom, and another Stardom match which was kind of being thrown around the internet recently, Utami Hayashishita versus Shuri at the Tokyo Dream Cinderella. That was the 40-plus minute match that Dave Meltzer said might have a similar effect for Stardom as some of the I can't remember the names of them, but there was a couple of matches that had kind of an expansion on the old All Japan's women's division stuff. So what this shows is how the pace or the use of certain metrics compared in the Bayley versus Asuka match and these kind of other matches that we're using to kind of give them some context. So, Sergei, is there anything that immediately catches your eye there?
Oh, for me, the biggest thing is that that in any of the other matches that you're comparing to, none of the other competitors come close to Asuka in terms of strike down rate. None of the other matchups come very close to Asuka versus Bayley in terms of the great difference between strikedown rates. The Riho versus Deeb would be the closest, but that's still quite a bit a greater discrepancy between the two opponents in Bayley versus Asuka. And Riho versus Deeb is a very different kind of match, despite having that level of similarity, with Bayley versus Asuka being heart versus almost impossible odds of just an unstoppable striker, whereas Riho versus Deeb is the like pure aerial good guy versus the technical specialist kind of a story. And I think that just looking at the numbers, I haven't watched Stardom. I keep hearing that I should, and I mean to, but have not yet done so. But everything about it tells me that, as far as the numbers and the interpretation of those numbers, is that that those matches were telling very different stories with very different characters, considering the difference in strikedown rates and in as you pointed out, you've got those zeros on submission on the one side and zeros on grapple dives on the other side, which you don't see any of that in any of these other matches. Well, I take that back. Actually, Riho versus Deeb, you do have 0 dives on Deeb's side and 0 submission on Riho's side. They are. They're definitely the most similar of the 4, is Riho versus Deeb and Bayley versus Asuka, although not exactly the same story being told there.
Yeah, it reminded me slightly of it, although obviously there is a heel-face dynamic in that match. The Utami, Hayashishita and the Shuri match, actually, in terms of dynamics, it's more similar because there's no real heel and face in that match. So when you look at the fouls in that match, it's the other one that it doesn't rely on fouls. Deeb is using loads against Riho and Julia is using loads against Tam Nakano. So that's really interesting. That the heel face dynamic kind of shows through so much in that manner. The other thing that
I did not notice how many fouls Deeb used.
That's divide that by 4 essentially. So it's a 14-minute match multiplied up to make it an hour. So it would have been around 7 or 8.
Right.
But
30 per hour on a per hour rate.
Yeah, basically. It's a lot in the short match. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I think really stands out in the NXT style match is, although it's short, they used such a huge amount of reversals in that time. I mentioned it earlier, but when you multiply it up to an hour rate, Bayley's reversal rate is 111 moves evaded or countered per hour. Asuka 68. Comparing to all these other matches, Riho, who is good at reversing moves. When you think of Riho, you think of her dodging and getting out and turning things into pins. She only just outdid Asuka and was nowhere near Bayley's pace, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I hadn't noticed that, and I think that you're right that it tells the story of her desperation and her, realizing what a difficult situation she was in order to reach her goals. That she had, she is putting her all into this, and very genuinely pretty intimidated by her opponent, and rightfully so. Within the story. Yeah.
And more so than, tiny Riho.
Oh, absolutely. That's another big difference, is that I call Asuka a monster babyface, but she's not big. She's smaller than Bayley.
No.
Bayley is a pretty big competitor. in her division. Riho is tiny, and I think because she's tiny, she can never act intimidated. She would be a terrible character if she was this little person who also acted scared of everybody. But she's never at all intimidated by, no matter what the situation. I mean, she fights Nyla Rose, and one of the most frustrating things, and I'm not one of the people who are like fire JR. But the only thing that I really do criticize him for was his insistence on claiming that Riho was the underdog every time she fought Nyla. It's like, how many times do you have to beat Nyla for her not to be considered the underdog, JR?
Mm-hmm. As while she's carrying around the championship as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. And just to underscore how interesting Asuka's performance was, again, she's the only one there that had such an extreme performance. Serena Deeb doesn't use any dives. That's not too uncommon, but Asuka's the only one that didn't use any grapples at all there. Wrestlers using grapples in a wrestling match is quite normal. You see a lot of suplexes, etc. being utilized. Asuka not using it at all is quite a particular performance. Is there anything there, Sergei, at all on the rest of that graph that you would like to highlight before we move along?
No, I think that we've discussed everything that ought to be discussed. Oh, one of these came to a draw. Time limit draw? No, that's an odd time. Mm-hmm. What was the reason for the draw being declared in Tommy versus Yuri? Just curious.
Yes, that was a really interesting way that came about. That's a title match, and in Stardom, like Japanese wrestling, they do have a time limit for title matches. In Japan, for men, it's usually 60. For the women, it is 30. So this went to a 30-minute draw, and then there was a bit of a kerfuffle at the end of the match as they both kind of still went at each other. And I think Shuri demanded that she get more time. That happened. They restarted the match, and then it ended with a double knockout. So it was like a double draw. And
so
Shuri,
they both failed to reach their feet at a 10 count, kind of a knockout.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good way to keep two people, really keep something alive and not settled. Mm-hmm. That's cool.
Yeah, and I think they are going to kind of like G1 kind of set up a title match, because they're doing their 5-star at the moment, which is the Stardom version of the G1, and the two of them are in the same group. So my guess is that Shuri will beat Utami in that kind of group match when it's non-title, and you'll see this match replayed again at some point, kind of a la Kenny Omega, Kazuchika Okada.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, it's really interesting rivalry, that one as well. Brilliant. So that is most of the kind of statistical analysis of kind of what we're going to talk about. I've got a couple more questions just towards the end to finish this up, Sergei. Mm-hmm. There's this kind of accusation being thrown around by certain members of the WWE management at the moment, saying that, and sort of podcast pundits as well, saying that NXT put on all these critically acclaimed matches, but NXT has failed in what it was originally designed to do, which was to create new stars. And when you kind of look at the men's side of NXT, it's hard to say that NXT has really created any stars. Drew McIntyre is maybe the only one to point at. I suppose you could say Roman Reigns, but you're kind of clutching at straws there. However, has NXT failed to create stars when you're looking at these women's wrestlers? When you think of the 4 horsewomen, is that accusation of NXT failing, is that slightly sexist because it's missing half the argument?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that that you're only the thought of only looking at the men's side of it is not only sexist, but it's also really missing out on the fact that up through this system came someone who is just no one since Austin, I would say, has gotten the level of fan connection and reaction as one particular wrestler that came from NXT. And I'm talking about Becky Lynch. When I was a big fan of NXT during this period, she wasn't my favorite of the four horsewomen plus Asuka. I always thought of them as the five, the five big women's wrestlers, the five biggest reasons to watch the show. And of those five amazing wrestlers, she was, one of the ones that I was least interested in. I was much more interested in Bayley, Asuka, at some extent Sasha and Charlotte. And, and when she came to SmackDown, it was just like, well, she's all right. And, not as interesting as these others. And then there was a moment she just broke out. I think that NXT, as it was, that there were two things it was intended to do. From a non-cynical point of view, you can make cynical arguments about it being intended to stifle the indies or whatever. But from a non-cynical point of view, they were looking to develop raw talent, and they were looking to bring in indie guys, men and women who aren't necessarily raw talent, who can work with that raw talent to help them, and then also learn a little bit more about the general WWE way of doing things and about working for TV that they can then apply to the main roster. And I think that it was, for the most part, effective at that. And I think that the thing that people are looking at with too much of a rose-colored glasses is that being effective at that didn't always make it the most entertaining show. It was a show that had its ups and downs based on who was there at any given time, because they would bring interesting new people in, and you knew those people were not there forever until they made that switch over of this isn't the developmental, this is Broadway. But before that, you didn't expect people to stay forever, and you expected there to be ups and downs of they're in a rebuilding phase. That's okay. I'm interested in this show just in general. I don't expect it to always be great. They'll turn it around and make it great again in the future. You had a certain level of faith in that at one time until they changed their goals a little bit so that you wouldn't expect it to have ups and downs in the same way when they decided to send Finn Balor back in we need this to be its own thing, and it's going to be its own thing in this new way. But the thing is, I think that for the most part, who connects with the audience in a unique way and who is able to get over isn't based on what they learned or how they were trained. It's a magic that you can't always even predict. I certainly didn't predict it in the case of Becky Lynch. Now, don't get me wrong, Bayley and Sasha are also fantastic, some of the best in the world. I don't want to, and then Asuka, geez, just one of the best in the world. And I don't want to, Charlotte's not my favorite of the bunch, but she certainly puts on excellent matches, which shouldn't be surprising since she pretty much always wrestles really great wrestlers among those people that I just mentioned.
True.
So,
true.
She has that advantage going for her. But I guess what I'm saying is that NXT's goal was do all of these things, but what mainly NXT did was it collected great talent. And why be surprised that great talent does great things?
Yeah, it was like a conveyor belt of great talent for, good 5 years almost. It was pretty impressive going, and that kind of element of always renewing was, as you say, when a bunch of them were called up. The next, Johnny Gargano stepped up, or whoever was next, Shayna Baszler, And my next question is more, this match I felt was more about Bayley, even though Asuka came out on top. How the obvious kind of thing that's always said about Asuka is they ruined it. They ruined it with Charlotte winning at WrestleMania. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, to me, Asuka, I mean, you can't carry on a winning streak forever. Not one who's going to say that, to second guess everything.
Yeah.
If she had to lose to somebody, there's nothing necessarily wrong with Charlotte. I think that what's next is where the problem was. And they didn't have a good idea for what was next. And I don't feel that anybody who were planning or deciding what she would do in the main roster had the strong sense of who her character is and how it worked that the people who worked with her in NXT did, because it never really felt the same again, in spite of the fact that it had the same music, and she certainly did the same moves, and she certainly still had the same talent, but the right stories for her weren't being told. And, you could make a case of, well, that's easy because in NXT they were still telling a winning streak story, so they never had to tell what does it look like when this character loses. And then, I mean, God, look at Goldberg's winning streak ending. Has there ever been anybody with a really popular winning streak story that gracefully handled the end of it? I don't know. But I definitely would say that the magic of Asuka was something that they lost, and that's also true, very much so, of others around that time, of Shinsuke, of Samoa Joe. They all had a lot of magic, and that was kind of in the way their characters were handled and the way their seeming dominance was handled, that it felt like once they reached the main roster that was not something they were able to replicate.
Yeah, totally agree. Last question, kind of topical, a little bit kind of tricky to answer perhaps. I would suggest that NXT did like huge amount for the women's revolution, TM, WWE, whatever. But you can't deny that they put on women's matches that were terrific. They really helped give them a platform. They really, really steered WWE away from kind of the offensive way that they were treating those matches previously. AEW are slated quite often for this. Will AEW ever get to a place where it will be spoken of in the same breath as NXT during this period was in regards to women's wrestling?
Well, I think that a year ago, I would have said, and everybody would have agreed with me, that in order to do that, they don't have the talent. They don't have the talent to accomplish it. And now, I don't think anybody would agree that. It's like, it's priorities and or storytelling, and I think mainly priorities, time priorities, that are holding back a division that's full of all the talent they need. I mean, God knows I would not turn down any horsewoman plus Asuka that they're able to grab. But if no crazy developments like we're seeing on the men's single side of CM Punk, Danielson, if we don't get that on the women's side of being able to steal away an Asuka or someone at that level, that's not needed to get the women's division to where it needs to be. They have the star power. They have the talent. It's just a matter of making the choices of, you know what, I have a lot of stories I'm trying to tell, but I need to make time for the women. And of course, what we've been told is that this extra hour with Rampage will fix that problem. And with our, I believe, second ever, if you don't count Dark Bait events, which I do not, Can't be dark and a main event. But I believe the second ever major, if we count pay-per-views, Dynamites, and Rampages major, the second major main event of women's wrestlers, of the women's division tonight. That's a great first step, or a great statement of purpose that's what they're in, that they are going to fulfill the promises that they have been hinting at, that the women's division and maybe even the tag division will see a resurgence with this new hour that they have to tell those stories with.
Yeah, so this is being recorded the night of Rampage, so this will be going out sometime in September, so you'll probably have a better idea than us, but Britt Baker
is know if we were right or wrong.
Yes, in the future. So Britt Baker is in the main event of Rampage in Pittsburgh, which I'm sure has something to do with it, but why wouldn't you, against Red Velvet? Britt Baker in both of those matches that you spoke about, so they do believe in her. They just need a few more women that they can build up to be on her level, I would suggest.
Well, I think that they have women that
they could do,
at least Thunder Rosa, at the very least, is believed in by their audience as being on the same level as Britt Baker. I don't know if that's true of any of the others, but that they could be. And then, of course, you have the heel-face dynamic of, obviously, the rookie green woman who's just really big.
Chris Statlander, Nyla Rose?
No.
Oh, Jade Cargill.
Jade Cargill. Yes. With a little bit of a push, and if she's not too green, she certainly could be considered on that level, but they're both heels, so how does that work out? But then again, will she stay heel? I hope that she's not, actually turned babyface, regardless of how much she's cheered. I mean, it's one of those cases of, well, they're cheering her for the things she's doing. If you change the things she's doing, you've lost what you had. But we'll see. We'll see how they're going to show us how they choose to handle that, and you in the future will be able to tell us how they did.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we are going to wrap up there. Thank you very much for joining me, Sergei. Would you like to tell the listeners where they can find you?
Oh, absolutely. So I put out a column just about every week called Styles Makes Fights. It is where I use the Styles Make Fights dashboard in order to analyze the mix of offense of different opponents in upcoming matches or in the previous week's matches, and talk about that. I'd like people to also keep in mind, every once in a while, I will go into it and see that it's not on the same wrestlers that I had it on, and someone has gone in there. That workbook is public, and there is a link to it on the Styles Make Fights tab. Anybody can look through it. It's all just drop-down boxes, and so you're not going to break my formulas or anything. So Styles Make Fights, I'd love to see more eyes on that column. I think that the analysis in it is, if I do say so myself, really worth your time to look at, and it gives you a different perspective on how the wrestler's offense plays into the stories they tell.
Yeah, it's really interesting. What Sergei tends to do is he previews an upcoming match, and he often will take, Red Velvet, he might find last time that she faced an opponent like Britt Baker and show that as if to give you an idea of what to expect. Or he might show you how somebody has progressed as a wrestler. So these matches, they were wrestling like this. Then a month later, they were wrestling like this. It's a really dynamic and useful tool, especially the ability to show differences across time. I particularly like that facet of it. So yeah, I agree. It is good analysis. Thank you very much for joining us. Please check out all of our work at ProWrestlingMusings.com. And thank you again for listening.